Carl Jung's most unsettling revelation was not centered on healing trauma in the conventional sense. Instead, it was about what he believed to be the final stage of empathic evolution in those who endured prolonged narcissistic abuse. According to his clinical notes, this transformation was both perilous and profound. It either shattered empaths completely or forged them into something psychologically rare, perhaps unprecedented in the history of his observations. Through years of therapeutic work, Jung encountered men and women whose empathic disposition had drawn them repeatedly into destructive relationships with narcissists. What fascinated him most were not the ordinary accounts of survival or recovery, but the instances where empaths underwent what he described as a complete psychic metamorphosis. These were the patients who emerged with what he called integrated shadow consciousness, a new psychological state that made them largely impervious to manipulation. Jung regarded this stage as dangerous, not because it harmed those who reached it, but because it changed them so radically that people who once knew them could hardly recognize them. He described this phenomenon as sovereign empathy, the ability to feel deeply while simultaneously being untouchable by exploitation or coercion. It was empathy unbound, profound, discerning, yet shielded by a kind of inner authority that few could comprehend. Today, I want to unfold Jung's most provocative insight about this empathic evolution. He argued that narcissistic abuse does one of two things. It either extinguishes sensitivity altogether, leaving behind emotional numbness, or it refines that sensitivity into what he referred to as the archetypal wounded healer, a mode of consciousness that transcends both victimhood and mere survival. One of Jung's most revealing cases dated back to 1928. In his private notes, he referenced a 34-year-old woman he identified only as M. She had an unusually acute sensitivity, a kind of porous emotional field, and this had attracted a succession of narcissistic partners who exploited her compassion. When she first sought Jung's guidance, she was, in his words, psychically dissolved. Her boundaries were so eroded that she could scarcely distinguish her own emotions from the emotional storms of others. Yet what unfolded in therapy astonished him. Over 2 years, M did not simply recover her equilibrium. She underwent what Jung likened to an alchemical transformation. Through a relentless confrontation with her own shadow, she developed what he termed conscious permeability, the deliberate ability to decide what emotions to absorb and what to deflect. She could still perceive others' suffering with intensity, but she was no longer consumed by it. Jung marveled at the change. In one entry, he wrote, "M has achieved something I once thought impossible. She can perceive deceit almost instantly, feel compassion without drowning in it, and remain immune to manipulation while retaining her humanity." For Jung, this was empathy in its highest and rarest form. The change was so striking that her family and acquaintances remarked she seemed like a different person. Formerly the emotional anchor of her household, she now held firm boundaries, and her refusal to be exploited was sometimes interpreted as coldness. But Jung recognized this as evidence of a higher development, not detachment. He even noted that her gaze had altered. Her eyes contained depths that suggest she has looked into the abyss of human nature and returned not broken, but transformed. Jung theorized that narcissistic abuse creates what he called the empathic crucible, a psychological furnace in which empaths are forced to confront not only the cruelty of others, but their own disowned traits. The narcissist becomes, in effect, an unconscious shadow mirror, forcing the empath to see qualities they had previously denied in themselves: the potential for self-interest, detachment, and even manipulation. He observed that empaths typically endured what he described as 3 symbolic deaths. First, the death of their self-image as purely benevolent. Second, the death of the belief that love alone could redeem anyone. And third, the most pivotal, the death of their dependence on outside validation to confirm their worth. Only by facing these deaths could an empath emerge reborn, not as a rescuer, but as an integrated individual. Those who survived this crucible, Jung found, gained what he called integrated empathy, the capacity to feel without absorbing, to understand without taking ownership, and to love without forfeiting their own center. This was not emotional numbness, but emotional mastery. Neurologically and psychologically, the shift resembled what meditation masters cultivated through decades of practice: heightened perception paired with selective processing. But here, it was trauma itself that served as the teacher. Jung noted, the narcissist, unknowingly, becomes the shadow instructor, compelling the empath to develop psychological muscles they would never otherwise discover. Still, Jung was troubled by one consistent outcome. Those who reached this stage often found themselves increasingly isolated, not because they desired solitude, but because they became incompatible with the unconsciousness that governed most social interactions. He described this as the consciousness gap. Once you can perceive projection, deceit, and manipulation in real time, ordinary conversations become fraught. Em herself described it poignantly. It feels as if I can see the hidden machinery behind every interaction, the defenses, the projections, the veiled motives. While this clarity protects me, it has cost me nearly every relationship I once valued. Jung called this the hidden danger of empathic evolution. Those who achieved this level of insight often carried what he described as archetypal sight, the ability to perceive beneath personas and into the psychological structures driving behavior. Such vision made them remarkable healers and guides, but it also made everyday social bonds fragile, sometimes untenable. He likened it to the biblical story of Adam and Eve. They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge. Innocence is lost. They cannot return to the garden of unconscious simplicity. Worse still, Jung found that others instinctively recoiled from these evolved empaths. Even without understanding why, people sensed their penetrating awareness and felt exposed. This led to what Jung called the prophet's isolation, being shunned not for being wrong, but for seeing too much. In multiple case studies, he documented how families, colleagues, and even fellow analysts grew uneasy around such individuals. They were avoided, not because of hostility, but because their presence silently revealed truths others preferred to keep hidden. From this body of work, Jung concluded that empaths who endure narcissistic abuse tend to follow one of four trajectories. The first path is collapse, where sensitivity is destroyed, leaving a hardened shell. The second is denial, where empathy becomes masked by compulsive caretaking, never addressing the shadow. The third is stagnation, where they retreat but remain fragile. And the fourth, rare but extraordinary, is transformation, the emergence of integrated empathy, shadow consciousness, and sovereign awareness. It was this fourth path that Jung believed could change not only the individual, but also the cultural understanding of empathy itself. For in these individuals, he saw the outline of what he called the wounded healer archetype, those who, by enduring devastation, gain the ability to heal others without being harmed themselves. Yet Jung did not romanticize this stage. He emphasized its cost: loneliness, misunderstanding, and sometimes exile. Still, he believed it represented one of the highest forms of individuation, to feel the world without being consumed by it, to love without losing oneself, and to stand unshaken in the presence of manipulation. Type 1. The dissolved empath. This group of empaths never managed to recover a stable sense of self. Jung described them as drifting psychic phantoms present in body, but absent in spirit. Their emotional boundaries collapse to the point where they cannot distinguish their own feelings from those of others. As a result, they live in constant emotional chaos. Jung observed that these individuals often fall into what he called a perpetual victim identity, repeatedly attracting partners or environments that echo the same cycles of abuse. Type 2. The armored empath. These empaths attempt to protect themselves by shutting down their sensitivity altogether. Jung likened them to people who have built impregnable psychological walls around their hearts. While this defense reduces the likelihood of further exploitation, it also cuts them off from their innate gift. Over time, many of them grow hard, skeptical, and emotionally detached. Jung noted that they essentially trade authenticity for safety. Type 3. The wounded healer. This type channels the pain of trauma into a calling to support others. While admirable, Jung cautioned that many remain locked in what he termed compulsive rescue patterns. They learn to set some boundaries, yet their sense of worth still hinges on being needed. Jung remarked, they have not fully confronted their own shadow and remain susceptible to more sophisticated forms of manipulation. Type 4. The sovereign empath. This was the stage Jung regarded as the highest form of empathic evolution. Here, the empath integrates both their natural sensitivity and their darker, rejected aspects into a unified whole. Jung wrote, they have become what I can only call conscious vessels capable of holding the totality of human experience without being depleted or corrupted by it. He listed several defining traits of sovereign empaths. They can sense the feelings of others without assuming responsibility for them. They recognize manipulation instantly, but respond with clarity and compassion rather than hostility. They enforce boundaries without resorting to cold detachment. They embody what Jung referred to as archetypal wisdom, perceiving the deep psychological currents beneath human behavior. What distinguished them most was that they had embraced their own shadow entirely, no longer projecting their denied darkness onto others. They became immune to the psychological hooks that narcissists typically exploit. The dangers of reaching this stage. Jung also documented serious risks linked to this advanced state of development, which made him question whether the evolution was worth its toll. The isolation factor. Sovereign empaths often found themselves profoundly alone. Having outgrown the psychological level of most people, they felt unable to connect. Jung compared it to adults trying to relate to children, noting that the consciousness gap created an unbridgeable distance. Many described feeling like outsiders, even within their families. The burden of sight. These empaths could no longer turn away from the psychological structures that govern behavior. Jung called this archetypal fatigue, the exhaustion of continually witnessing unconscious patterns, repeating in relationships, politics, and culture. They could often predict outcomes long before others could see them. The weight of responsibility. Many reported feeling overwhelmed by their insights. They could see paths of healing for others, but new unsolicited guidance was rarely welcomed. Jung termed this the Cassandra complex, having accurate foresight that others dismiss or reject. The demand for authenticity, perhaps most challenging. Jung found that sovereign empaths could no longer tolerate falseness in themselves or others. They functioned like living truth detectors, instantly aware when someone was being manipulative or insincere. This made ordinary social interaction extremely difficult. Jung concluded, they have reached psychological mastery, but at the expense of ordinary human connection. They function as bridges between the conscious and the unconscious. Yet bridges are meant to be crossed, not embraced. Stage 1. Shadow acknowledgement. Jung insisted empaths must first acknowledge their own capacity for manipulation, selfishness, and cruelty. You cannot integrate what you refuse to own. He wrote, this involves recognizing how their empathic gifts may have been used to control others, how their victimhood may have been weaponized, and how their goodness may have been a mask for deeper psychological needs. Stage 2. Projection withdrawal. Jung taught empaths to systematically withdraw their projections from the narcissist. This means recognizing that the narcissist's grandiosity reflected their own disowned desire for recognition, that the narcissist's manipulation reflected their own subtle controlling behaviors, and that the narcissist's lack of empathy reflected their own hidden emotional numbness. Stage 3. Boundary alchemy. Rather than building walls, Jung taught what he called conscious permeability, the ability to choose moment by moment what to absorb and what to deflect. This involves developing what Jung termed empathic discernment, feeling without fixing, understanding without rescuing, and loving without losing oneself. Stage 4. Archetypal alignment. Jung believed the final stage involved aligning with what he called the wounded healer archetype, accepting that their suffering had prepared them for a specific role in the collective unconscious. This is not about becoming a professional healer, but about embodying the integration of wisdom and compassion that Jung believed was essential for human evolution. Jung wrote specific practices for each stage, including what he called shadow dialoguing, consciously conversing with the parts of themselves they had disowned, empathic fasting, deliberately choosing periods of emotional non-absorption, and archetypal meditation, connecting with the deeper patterns that govern human behavior. The key insight Jung emphasized was that empaths must stop trying to return to who they were before the abuse. The chrysalis cannot become a caterpillar again. He wrote, the goal is not recovery, but metamorphosis. Jung studied historical figures to understand what determined whether empathic individuals achieved sovereign consciousness or were destroyed by their sensitivity. His analysis revealed patterns that applied directly to modern narcissistic abuse recovery. Success pattern. Carl Jung himself. Jung revealed in his private writings that his own psychological theories emerged from surviving what he called psychological persecution by authority figures who tried to manipulate his empathic nature. Jung wrote, my tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers, forcing me to develop the psychological tools that would become my life's work. Jung achieved sovereign empathy by refusing to become bitter, by studying his tormentors as psychological specimens rather than personal enemies, and by transforming his insights into service for others. His method became the template for empathic integration. Success pattern. Historically documented cases. Jung documented several patients who achieved similar integration. 1. A composer who survived an abusive marriage channeled her trauma into music that Jung described as archetypal. speaking directly to the collective unconscious. Another, a physician, developed unprecedented diagnostic abilities after surviving psychological manipulation by colleagues. The common thread Jung identified was their ability to see their abuse as an initiation rather than victimization. They understood their experience as preparation for a larger purpose rather than random cruelty. Failure pattern: the gifted who did not integrate. Jung also studied historical empaths who were destroyed by their sensitivity. He noted they typically fell into one of two traps. Either they remained identified as victims, using their trauma as their primary identity, or they became what Jung called wounded wounders, using their psychological insights to manipulate and control others. Jung wrote, "The difference between the sovereign empath and the destroyed empath is not the severity of their trauma, but their willingness to transform poison into medicine." The failure pattern always involved what Jung called shadow rejection, refusing to acknowledge their own capacity for the very behaviors that had wounded them. Jung recognized that sovereign empaths needed entirely different types of relationships than typical empaths. He developed what he called consciousness compatibility theory to help them find authentic connections. Recognition signals: Jung identified that other evolved empaths could be recognized by their ability to discuss psychology without becoming defensive, their comfort with paradox and contradiction, their lack of need to be right or superior, and what Jung called archetypal humor, the ability to find lightness in the darkest human patterns. Safe relationship characteristics: Jung noted that healthy relationships for sovereign empaths involved mutual respect for psychological boundaries, comfortable silence without the need to fill space with chatter, the ability to discuss shadow aspects without judgment, and what Jung termed conscious intimacy, connection based on authentic self-revelation rather than projection. Community-building strategies: Jung recommended that sovereign empaths seek others who had undergone similar transformative experiences. Not necessarily narcissistic abuse, but any experience that forced rapid psychological evolution. He noted that trauma survivors, spiritual seekers who had faced their shadow, and individuals who had survived major life transitions often made compatible companions. Jung warned against trying to maintain relationships with unconscious individuals out of guilt or obligation. The butterfly cannot pretend to still be a caterpillar. He wrote, "Attempting to do so serves no one and dishonors the transformation." He also recommended what he called archetypal service, using their evolved empathic abilities to serve the collective unconscious through teaching, healing, creating, or simply modeling integrated consciousness. Jung documented that the transformation from wounded empath to sovereign empath follows what he called the 5 metamorphoses, each marked by specific psychological shifts and challenges. Metamorphosis 1. The dissolution. The first stage occurs during the height of abuse, when the empath's old identity collapses under the weight of manipulation. Jung described this as a kind of psychological death, not annihilation, but ego dissolution that prepares the psyche for rebirth. Here the empath encounters what Jung called blessed disintegration, the destruction of false self-images and idealized notions of who they thought they were. Though terrifying, this breakdown is the necessary prelude to a deeper reconstruction of the self. Metamorphosis 2. The descent. In the aftermath of abuse, the empath enters what Jung likened to a descent into the underworld. This is not passive collapse, but an involuntary initiation. They must confront their shadow, acknowledge how they participated in the toxic dynamic, and face their deepest insecurities about worthiness and lovability. Jung wrote that this stage often looks like depression, but is better understood as psychological composting, the breakdown of what no longer serves, fertilizing the ground for growth. The despair is real, but it is also the soil of transformation. Metamorphosis 3. The integration. At this stage, the empath begins to reclaim fragments of the shadow consciously. Jung referred to this as selective shadow incorporation. The empath learns to embrace their anger without becoming cruel, to acknowledge selfish impulses without devolving into narcissism, and to own their personal power without resorting to manipulation. This phase demands discernment. The goal is not to reject difficult traits outright, but to integrate them in a balanced, constructive way. Through this process, the empath begins to feel more whole, more grounded, and less vulnerable to exploitation. Metamorphosis 4. The emergence. Here, the empathic gift reappears but in a transformed state. Empaths in this phase can sense others' emotions without drowning in them. They detect manipulation with clarity, but rather than lashing out, they respond with composure and compassion. They can love with depth, but no longer at the expense of their own center. Jung observed that these abilities resemble a refined sensitivity, permeability with choice. It is empathy anchored in selfhood rather than entanglement. Metamorphosis 5. The sovereignty. The final metamorphosis is the birth of what Jung called archetypal consciousness. At this level, empaths transcend individual psychology and begin perceiving the broader patterns that govern human behavior. They become conscious bridges, links between the personal and the collective, between ego awareness and the deeper self. Jung considered this the culmination of individuation itself, the point where one lives not only as an individual, but as a participant in humanity's evolutionary unfolding. The timeline and the traps. Jung estimated that each metamorphosis could last 6 to 18 months, with the entire process often requiring 3 to 7 years of sustained inner work. Still, he stressed that progress was not linear. It depended on the individual's willingness to face shadow material and their commitment to integration rather than mere survival. He also warned of several traps that could derail the process. The spiritual superiority trap. Some empaths, having glimpsed their advanced abilities, slip into what Jung termed spiritual inflation, believing themselves beyond the shadow. Jung cautioned, the moment one believes they are past the shadow, they are possessed by it. The perpetual healing trap. Others become addicted to transformation itself, chasing endless workshops or therapies without ever embodying their gains. Jung called this therapeutic materialism, treating healing like consumption. The isolation trap. While solitude is necessary at times, Jung warned against using psychological evolution as an excuse to withdraw from all connection. Sovereignty must be lived in relationship, not only in retreat. The revenge trap. Some empaths attempt to weaponize their newfound insight, using it to subtly punish or manipulate those who once harmed them. True integration, Jung taught, transforms the urge for revenge into compassion for the unconscious. To avoid these pitfalls, Jung recommended daily shadow check-ins, a practice of examining one's motives, projections, and emotional responses to ensure alignment with consciousness rather than complexes. The larger implication, an evolutionary leap. Jung's final insight into sovereign empaths was radical. He believed they represented an evolutionary step forward in human consciousness. Souls capable of feeling the full spectrum of human experience while remaining anchored in their own truth. The sovereign empath, Jung wrote, embodies the bridge between ego awareness and self-realization. As collective life grows more psychologically complex, Jung saw these individuals as essential guides. He envisioned them as midwives of consciousness, helping others navigate their own shadow work and empathic development. Their wounds were not merely personal, but archetypal, carrying within them the pain and potential of the collective, from wound to wisdom. Jung taught that the empath who survives narcissistic abuse and reaches this final stage undergoes what he called the ultimate individuation, becoming fully themselves while serving something larger. This, he warned, is not an easy path. It is costly, often isolating, and profoundly transformative. But it proves that catastrophe can be the birthplace of consciousness, that wisdom can be distilled from suffering, and that wounds once meant to destroy us may in fact initiate us into sovereignty. He summarized this in his final notes. The narcissist unknowingly serves as the dark priest of the empath's initiation. Through their cruelty, they forge the very consciousness that will ultimately heal what they represent. A call to transformation. Your journey, too, can be seen in this light. If you recognize yourself in these stages, understand that the suffering you have endured is not meaningless. It may be the initiation into sovereign empathy, not despite your wounds, but through them. So if you feel the resonance of this path, affirm it. I am becoming sovereign. Your evolution is not just for your healing, but for the healing of humanity itself.